This is a historic moment. This particular panel took a lot of years of asking, saying, we tend to focus on how the drug war is advanced by criminalization, the way people are put in jail, the millions and millions of Americans who end up in jail and prisons in the United States, how it accounts for our extraordinary rate of incarceration, greater than any place in the world. And yet it's possible that more people are affected by our child welfare systems than by our prison industrial complex. And that system, no less than the criminal justice system, has been influenced by the war on drugs. It has become a major vector for the war on drugs, and we're going to hear a lot about that from our panel. Just by way of a little bit of introduction, child welfare systems have, in the United States, always been used to target certain populations and based on certain assumptions. So it was used to destroy Native American communities, removing children from their families and putting them in boarding schools. It was used to separate immigrant children from their parents. And it has become a primary mechanism for undermining African American families, particularly through the claims about the association between drug use and an ability to parent that we will hear about. It is also a mechanism by which we reinforce the notion, particularly that demeans and discounts Black motherhood in the United States of America, so well articulated by Dorothy Roberts, and a devaluing and a disregard for Black motherhood that grows directly out of slavery. In trying to persuade the DPA, and I thank you very much for allowing us to have this panel, I explained that when the United States, the federal government was starting to lose steam on new federal laws to criminalize drug use, to criminalize drug users, they started enacting civil child welfare laws. Civil child welfare laws are typically passed by states, not the federal government. But in 2003, the CAPTA, Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, a mechanism for getting federal money to the states, was amended to say every state must have a statement that says we have a mechanism for reporting drug-affected newborns to state authorities. It didn't actually say drug-exposed. It doesn't actually require that you treat drug-exposed children as if they have been abused, but the federal government, having lost steam in the criminal justice field, moved directly into child welfare. Before that, many states in the 1990s, as a result of various drug panics, amended their civil child welfare laws. 12 states explicitly said that evidence of drug use is the same as evidence of child abuse. Many more states have court decisions that reach that conclusion, and even states like California that says you may not use a positive drug test. Oh, by the way, I never go anywhere on these speeches. Here is a drug sample. There is nothing in this that can tell you how I parent and whether I love my children, or even whether I'm addicted or my drug use is problematic for me. And yet, every single day in courtrooms across the United States, this is used to determine whether or not somebody can keep their child, whether they can be subjected to virtually endless surveillance and controlled by the state. In any event, even states like California that said you may not use a positive drug test as a basis for reporting unless you have a whole lot of other, you must have other things. They still, in Los Angeles, Medicaid moms are reporting. They spend billions of dollars on drug testing and then reporting them anyway to child welfare. New York State says drug misuse is a basis for reporting and involving child welfare. But people treat the evidence of use. They don't just use misuse. And what we know is that African American children are the most overrepresented group in child welfare. In every state, in nearly every state, a disproportionate number of African American children are in foster care. And in a study in New York, the second leading reason for parents being reported to child welfare was allegations of parental drug use, 54% of those cases. So we're going to hear a lot more about this. I'm going to briefly introduce each of our panelists. They will introduce themselves, and I have a starting question for each of them. Dr. Teel is Doctor of Social Work at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Colorado School of Medicine. She's done policy research on how drug policies affect pregnant women who are parenting. Emma Ketteringham here is managing attorney of the family defense practice of the Bronx Defenders. She was also before that, or in between that, the first director of legal advocacy at National Advocates for Pregnant Women. I am grateful for all that we learned from her. Dr. Hart is a tenured professor at Columbia University in New York in the psychology department, and psychiatry department, and he is author of this book. Buy it if you haven't already. That would be good. High Price, a neuroscientist's journey of self-discovery that challenges everything you know about drugs and society. Jess Cochrane. She is a law student at Northeastern University and an MPH student at Tufts, yes. She's co-founder of the Family Law and Cannabis Alliance, and she is, Northeastern Law School is unique, and it's, their law students have to do co-ops, so they actually have to go somewhere and work for long periods of time. And the Drug Policy Alliance and my organization, National Advocates for Pregnant Women, are in a major battle about who can have more of her time. And Sara Arnold is an expert on the child welfare system. She's a parent, a long-term drug policy reformer, and the other co-founder of the Family Law and Cannabis Alliance. I'm going to start with Emma and ask you to talk to us about what you see, and you represent parents in the child welfare system. What do you see as the intersection between the war on drugs and the child welfare system? If you could give us a little bit of an overview and example of how you see it playing out.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Emma, and as Lynn said, I work in the South Bronx. And I actually started my legal career as a public defender working in the criminal legal system. But I started to learn from my clients that those who were arrested for drugs while their criminal cases resolved rather quickly, their children remained languishing in foster care, often based solely upon allegations that they had used a drug, or that they had possessed a drug, or that they lived in a neighborhood where drugs were sold. And I became curious about that, and I couldn't believe it. I sort of had been able to resolve their criminal cases really easily, often with a non-criminal disposition, without time in jail, and but you know, they'd find me a couple months later, or I'd see them in line in the rain outside of family court waiting to go back into court, and I was like, what are you doing here? Your case is over. And they would say, no, you know, they took my kids when I was arrested, and they're still in foster care. And I have a lawyer who doesn't show up to my court dates, and I've asked for a visit. I've gone to court, told that my case would be called at 9 a.m., and they run out of time, so my case is never held, so I go 3 more months without even visitation with my children. And I just really couldn't believe it, so we basically, and some of us started to go into Bronx Family Court and represent some of our clients who had been arrested and now also had these family law allegations and allegations of neglect. And we started to learn about that system, and I have to say I oftentimes regret the day that I ever walked in those doors, because as Lynn said, I've left the work and I've come back to the work because I can't turn away from what I see there. The way the drug war plays out in family court is that what's at stake is not your liberty, but your children. And it's children who languish in foster care because of drug use. And what we see all sorts of cases. We see cases that come in because women are tested without their consent when they give birth, and it comes up positive for a drug. That's our stop and frisk. Everyone's talking about stop and frisk and police stopping people in poor neighborhoods. Our stop and frisk is the test and report. Our clients are tested without their consent, and their results are turned over to child protective authorities, and they're reported as child abusers. And as a result, often their children are taken from them and put in foster care. We also see clients like my client Shanique, who was in her house one day when she has a 19-year-old son, 3 girls who are 8, 7, and 6, Chastity, Destiny, and Shamika. and a little 2-year-old, Kayla. And she lives in a neighborhood in the South Bronx, which is considered, quote, drug infested, but really is a place where the police are rolling up and doing buy and bust all the time. No more drugs probably than the Upper West Side, but it's just where the police are stopping everyone and coming into their homes. And one afternoon, Shanique was sitting with Kayla on her bed and they were playing a game on her phone when a loud noise startled her, and the police busted into her apartment, ordered her and her 19-year-old son, Rondell, on the floor. Kayla tried to reach for her mother, and an armed officer in plain clothes, so it was sort of hard to tell who these men were who had come up in their apartment, was holding Kayla away from her mother. And they searched the apartment. They claimed that they knew that an undercover officer had bought drugs in the apartment earlier that afternoon. And so they came in, and they took Kayla, and they took Shanique, and they took Rondell. They brought Shanique and Rondell to the police precinct, where they were booked and charged, but not with selling drugs, because of course they hadn't sold drugs, and there was no evidence that they had sold drugs. In fact, there was no pre-recorded buy money that the undercover officer claimed he just used to buy the drugs. There were no drugs in the apartment except for a half-smoked joint in Rondell's jacket pocket, which he readily admitted was his. His mother didn't know about it. And in fact, the DA was pretty reasonable, right? The prosecutor took a look at that evidence and said, this sucks, I'm gonna let you go home. But Kayla, who was also taken from the hospital and who was 2 years old, didn't leave foster care for 8 months because the allegation was that her mother had been selling drugs with her in the apartment. And it took us 8 months to prove that that wasn't true in family court. And that's in part because it's a system much more broken than the criminal legal system. And just to go on, Destiny, Chastity, and Shamika, who were in school that day when the police came into the apartment, Child Protective Services went to their school and pulled them out of their classrooms and asked them questions like, did they know what drugs look like? And had they ever seen their mom under the influence of drugs? Did strange people come in and out of their apartment? And they didn't learn what happened to their mom for 3 days. All they knew is that they were taken to a really ugly building in downtown Manhattan and made to stay there until a foster family that they didn't know came to pick them up. And that's where they stayed for 8 months. So no one's even really talking about the drug war in the child welfare system. But this war is, the effects of this war in the child welfare context really needs to be understood as interfering with the right of some people to even just bear and raise children. Because once you're in that system, everything you do is scrutinized. You can never measure up. I live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, which is a relatively affluent, liberal, progressive community where, the other day I was at a cocktail party and someone whipped out a little vial and they said, hey, this is liquid THC, ever seen it? And our kids were playing the Wii in the other room, and we were all sitting around drinking wine and talking about liquid THC, and no, I didn't do it because I'm not very good at doing drugs, but I would have, if it didn't scare me so much. But I went home with my kids, right? And the next day I go to work in the South Bronx, and my clients are losing their kids because marijuana was at a party. And it's really kind of unbelievable how differently parents are treated. I want to give everyone a chance to talk, but I hope that kind of gives an overview of how these cases come in and what they look like once they do. And happy to answer any questions that anyone has.
I'm going to have 2 questions for each of you. So Carl, I'm starting with a different question than I warned you about. And so that question is, there really is this extraordinary assumption that if you know somebody is using a drug, or perhaps if you know somebody of a certain color who's using a drug, that it will affect their parenting, that they can't parent. And you have done research on human subjects, you've watched people and studied them when they have taken drugs, and you've been asked to testify about it. So could you talk a little bit about what the research actually shows? Can we know how somebody can parent and whether they're capable of calling 911 if their kid falls down, if we know that they smoke marijuana?
Yeah, so good afternoon, everybody. As Lynn pointed out, one of the things I do is I bring people into the lab and test drugs, and test the drugs on their cognition on a wide range of behaviors. And as Emma was talking about the stories that she was telling, I was completely ignorant to this sort of thing going on in the country until I became friends with Lynn, and so Lynn has me testifying in court cases now. So working with Emma and Lynn, I've learned quite a bit about family court. So I guess my experience is that I typically try to help the women get their children back. So by the time that I get involved, the children have been removed because the women involved, all black, the ones I've dealt with so far, by the time I get involved, the children have been taken. And the women typically have tested positive for a drug, and that drug is marijuana. That's the only drug that I've seen so far, marijuana, because marijuana stays in the urine for up to a couple of weeks after smoking, whereas something like cocaine is gone in a couple of days. So you won't typically test positive for cocaine, and we don't test people for alcohol. The alcohol will stay in your system, can stay in your sweat and so forth for a couple of days as well. So most of these women have tested positive for marijuana. And then so there's a case file, and I have to go through the case file, and I'm looking for whether or not these women meet criteria for substance abuse, substance dependence, or a substance use disorder, addiction. That's what I'm looking for. And invariably, as you go through the case file, the only thing that the women are guilty of is testing positive for marijuana. But the case file is really large and extensive, so we can see whether or not the women are bad parents. So we can tell whether the kids are going to school, whether the kids are eating, whether they are whether they're clean, a wide range of things we can tell based on the case file, because the case worker can show up at the house at any time they want, and they do. So they come unannounced, and then the women have to let these caseworkers in, and it's all documented, because in many cases the women may have a partner, and then you can imagine if a caseworker comes to your place in the evening and you may be relaxing, having family time, I don't know, and this person wants to come in and be invasive, and you might not be so pleasant to that person. So if you say like, well, you know, we're busy, we would prefer you not be here, it's in the case file is that you were not being cooperative, that you had something to hide. This is how it's written in the case file. So the case is constantly trying to be built or made that there is a problem in the household. And oftentimes, the problem has nothing to do with drugs. It becomes about something else. And so you go through these, I've gone through these things, and I have never seen a case where the person actually met criteria for addiction, but the kids are gone. And so now, testifying in court, you have the state attorney, do they call them the state attorney? The person who is trying to remove the children from the house, and then you also have the person who's trying to represent the woman to get her children back. They both are equally ignorant about drugs. So it becomes this sort of exchange in ignorance in court. And so now my job is basically to talk to the judge and try to educate the judge in the case. And frankly, the judges have been, at least when I've been in court, they've been pretty good. They've been listening. They tell me that, wow, that judge normally sleeps. They were actually listening to you. So they've been okay, but like I said, my job is to try to show the judge how we cannot tell anything about the parent's behavior, the parent's ability to parent, based on a positive urine test. And in doing this, I oftentimes like to use alcohol as a comparator drug. And I say things like, well, if we test the attorney, for example, the one asking me all the hospital questions about, if we test that
attorney that morning,
if we test that attorney right now, we could probably get some alcohol metabolites in their sweat urine. But that tells us nothing about their ability to ask me these questions. And so that becomes a revelation to the judge. They didn't realize that oftentimes. And so it's important that we educate the judges, and sometimes they're quite open, but it's just that they just didn't know. Like me, I didn't know this sort of thing was happening in our courts. So it's important for us to educate them. And I found that my final sort of comment is that when I go to these courts, I've only gone and testified in Brooklyn Family Court. It is like taking a step back in time, because all of the defendants are black, and maybe some brown, Latino as well. And all of the judges and the lawyers are white. And all of the security personnel are black and brown. So they're sort of like the house Negroes, if you will. And so it feels like slavery all over again in family courts. But apparently you all can go to your family court any day and you can see this stuff playing out. And I'm told that it plays out like this around the country.
Dr. Hart, I just have to say that thank you for doing this. The problem is that there aren't enough experts to go around, and the child welfare system shouldn't be allowed to put caseworkers on to testify as to science in the first place. Science is, can you tell from a drug test whether somebody can parent? That's social science, that's medicine, that's psychology. And the only people who should be allowed to testify to that are people who are qualified to do so. And part of the reason they listen to Dr. Hart is because they've never heard from an expert, ever. And so these systems should be able to be shut down by just saying, you're not qualified to testify. We shouldn't have to make Dr. Hart leave all the other things he's doing in order to testify. But it is very, very effective, and we're very grateful. And too many people with his training and experience refuse to do so. And sometimes when they do go, they're shocked and they feel traumatized by the experience, even though they have enormous privilege. Carl, I just want to say, like they say on the airlines, when you at the end of the flight, they say, we know you had a choice which airlines. And I just want to say, you had a choice of which round table to attend. You were scheduled for another one, and you chose this one. So thank you. So, Dr. Teel, people don't know a lot about how the child welfare system operates. They think it sounds nice and protective and something that will help families. I know many doctors report people to child welfare thinking, okay, well, they're going to get the expert help that they need, and I don't have to worry about it. And they have no idea what actually happens once people are in the system as a result of federal policy and as a result of practice. So I was wondering if you could talk about both of those things.
Absolutely, and I'd like to start with kind of my premise or argument even that the war on drugs in this country has been going on for 20, 25, 30 years. And there's really been a parallel process in terms of our child welfare policies in the country that really goes back to the late 80s and the early 90s when the federal law started changing, largely in part to crack cocaine use by women. So I'm glad, again, that we've had advocates to even have a little discussion here about this. My experience for the last 15 years has been here in Colorado and specifically in the Denver metro area. And I continue to learn how things are different here than they are in other states. One thing, though, that I want to share is that in this Denver metro area, that you've all either visited or maybe you live here, there are 4 counties. And Colorado is very much a local control state. And so we literally have 4 counties that do their child welfare interventions according to their own particular culture. And beyond just which county, which side of the street you live on, I have found that there's a lot of discretion depending on which intake worker gets the call and how that individual intake worker views the risk to the child. That's their primary job, is keeping children safe. So there's a lot of discretion within the child welfare system itself. There's no real agreement or standard in terms of what constitutes harm. So lots of variation as to what happens. The other thing I wanted to speak to is that over the years, one of the main changes I have seen that are impacting families where substance use are involved is the federal laws around expedited permanency planning. And this happens anytime the child is removed from the parent and placed in what is called out-of-home care. And the minute the child is removed, so let's say newborns, which is my particular area of interest that are often removed, the clock starts ticking. And in Colorado, since the beginning of the federal law, 12 months has been the time period that families are given to correct their situation where the child can return home. And if not, then by law, the state has to move for termination of parental rights. And my experience in watching families is that nobody waits for that 12 months. And we had a family involved in our work in the last year who had an infant who was removed when she was 2 months old, and literally after 2 months in out-of-home placement, that county was recommending termination of parental rights, no concurrent reunification plan. So ultimately, there was some intervening, and they have given her more time, but more likely than not, 12 months is not much time, especially for women who maybe have been using half their life and they have a lot that they need to do. And I think in terms of the harms of the drug war, a lot of women I've talked to who have in fact spent time in jail say they would rather go to jail, incarcerate me, just don't take my child away. And so the separation of parents and their children, I think, is an ongoing harm from the drug war.
There's a, you know, if you, that if you want to destroy communities and prevent people from taking political action, you know, you, let's try again. There it goes. Is that better? No. How's that? There it goes. Okay. So if you want to undermine a community and its ability to take action, you put the men in jail and you threaten the women with losing their kids. And it's a brilliant wraparound strategy. And it's not to say there aren't women who go to jail and there aren't men who lose their children. But you keep people unable to do anything. And you'll hear a little bit more about what happened, what are the demands on people once they're in the child welfare system. So you can be damn sure that it's very hard to have the time to take political action. Although this may be the opposite of what actually happened to our next speaker. Sara, you fight the persecution of pregnant women, parents, and legal guardians because they use cannabis medically or recreationally. How did you get involved in this issue?
As Lynn just said, I'm Sara Arnold. I'm the co-founder of Family Law and Cannabis Alliance. I also go by Sara Kant, and the reason I go by a pseudonym is because I've had experience with Child Protective Services. So I want to keep it a little bit under from all the drug policy work I do. I've been doing drug policy longer than I've been a parent. So I'm a medical marijuana user. I have mental and physical health issues, and medical marijuana does help me be a better parent. If I did not take my medicine, I would not be able to parent. I'd be in bed, I'd be asleep, I'd be throwing up, I'd be on the toilet. That's probably all the information you need. But when I got pregnant with my first child, my daughter Liberty, who I gave birth to in 2010, I was honest with my prenatal providers. I think honesty is a really important thing with your medical providers, and generally social service providers, anybody. Oops.
Generally.
Yeah. I didn't really know what I was doing. What I was doing was I was telling them, please make a mandated report against me for using marijuana while pregnant. I've actually been investigated 4 times over the course of both of my children's lives. I have a 3-year-old now and a 9-month-old for being honest with prenatal providers and social service providers. And I've been investigating, and what that basically means is my life is open to them. They come to my house, they look and see if my child is bruised. I smoke pot, I have not hit my kid. They call my doctor, make sure they know. It's in my medical records, they know. They call my kids' doctors, they also know. They ask personal questions about my sex life, my childhood, things that have no relation to either my medical marijuana use or my parenting. And it's traumatizing. It's traumatizing to go through that, especially when you first give birth, because I don't know how many people are mothers in this room, but you remember all those crazy hormones you had when you first gave birth? Now imagine getting a call from somebody on the phone asking you if you've ever smoked marijuana. Obama smoked marijuana. Is he going to get an investigation on his kids? Probably not.
No, he doesn't have a uterus.
His wife does, and she's not going to get it either. Even in drug policy, this is kind of the third rail a little bit. You get a lot of judgment from drug reformers, like, well, you know, if you went to jail, maybe that wouldn't be the wrong thing, because who should go to jail for smoking pot? But, you know, you have kids, so maybe they should investigate you, at least to make sure. But there's no reason for that, and what that actually does is hurt me, and it hurts my family. And I'm blessed for being able to be at this conference, having the access I have. Every day in my work with FLCA, with the Family Law and Cannabis Alliance, where we try to help other people, lawyers with their cases, media, we've done a lot of research, we do state profiles, and, you know, sorry to swear here, but the laws in this country about this are fucked. And even the states which have parental protection provisions, they're ignored. Their child protective services is like, well, you know, maybe we can't take your kids away because, you know, there's no burden for that, but we can investigate you. We can say, here's your choice. Kids are your medicine. We can give you a service plan you have to follow, and if you don't agree with it, you're being non-compliant. And then, while you're being non-compliant, it's not about drugs anymore. So then they can start taking your kids. And as has been said, it really is more broken than the criminal justice system. I don't mean to compare, but I would rather spend the rest of my life in prison without parole than have my kids in foster care. I'd rather be dead than have my kids in foster care. I love my girls, and you know, they're the most important thing to me. Every time I'm investigated, I stop talking. You ever see me go silent, you know what I'm going through, because you can't kick the hornet's nest. Parents have to be really careful when they come forward about this. If you do it without legal advice, you're going to lose your kids. So you have to be really, really careful.
Good advice.
So Jess, I was wondering if you could touch on a couple of things, or several actually. One of the forces that we've seen that is encouraging this kind of advance of child welfare systems, and also the linkage between child welfare, report to child welfare, then goes to the police, is this group called Drug Endangered Children. I'd like you to talk about that. And I'd also like to ask you, so when you succeed in decriminalizing or legalizing marijuana in Colorado and Washington, what does that mean in terms of what could happen in the child welfare system, and what does happen when you, in terms of your ability to be represented when you're in that system?
First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for coming today and being here, and preface what I'm about to say by telling everyone that I'm committed to drug policy reform, that this is what I plan to spend my life doing, and so any criticisms that I'm about to level are loving. I'll use the example of Colorado's Amendment 64, which has legalized, and when we say legalize in the movement or decriminalize, we are stuck in a criminal paradigm. We are stuck in a legal means not criminal. And what that doesn't account for is the fact that CPS and family courts are non-criminal legal proceedings. And that means that they play by a different set of rules. And so when we passed, when Colorado voters passed Amendment 64, it was a huge victory. But there was nothing in that about parenting. There was nothing in that to say that it's legal for recreational use among adults over the age of 21 and who happen to be parents. That's not in it. And the opponents know that. The people who are against Amendment 64, they know that. And they also know that they're fighting tooth and nail against the reform movement. And they're doing it in the name of children. And that brings me to DEC, the Drug Endangered Children Movement. There's an organization called the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. It's also at the state level in many states. And this group was formed in response to children being found in methamphetamine laboratories. And so they were very concerned about the exposure to toxic chemicals that these children were experiencing. And the DEC alliances are composed of powerful people who work in law enforcement, CPS, teachers, other folks who work with children in their professional lives. And they were able to successfully lobby in many states to pass laws that define child abuse or neglect explicitly as exposure to illegal drugs. In some cases, specifically methamphetamine, but in other cases, all drugs, controlled substances. And so they were written in a way that is overly broad for the issue that they were concerned with, but they've taken it on as a crusade. And after Amendment 64 was passed in Colorado, the Drug Endangered Children group here in this state attempted to pass a bill in the legislature that would explicitly define child abuse or neglect as exposure to controlled substances under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. And as you can probably imagine, that was an attempt to circumvent Amendment 64 in the context of parenting. That was ultimately not successful, and the bill was amended to allow the state's methamphetamine task force to now define drug endangered children. So we have to look forward to on January 1st, by January 1st, 2014, we have to look forward to a new definition of child abuse by drug endangerment here in Colorado. I also just want to touch briefly on the differences between civil and criminal cases in the legal system. Many people are aware of the due process protections that criminal defendants have, the right to representation by a competent attorney, the right, the standard of proof that the case must be proven beyond a reasonable doubt to convict someone of a crime, and the fact that that there are rules of evidence that make sure that what is admitted against a defendant is reliable. But those things don't apply in family court or in administrative CPS hearings, which means that the evidence that is being used against parents is not of the same standard. This goes to what we were saying earlier, why Dr. Hart is so needed in family courts, because hearsay evidence is readily admitted against parents. And in not every state are you guaranteed an attorney. We need to account for this in our reforms. Even when we pass medical marijuana laws that protect patients from arrest and prosecution, they're not protected from CPS. They're not protected in child custody disputes. It's an issue that we need to talk about. It's an elephant in the room. We see cases coming up all the time. And I'm very grateful for the platform here, for the opportunity to speak about it, and for being on this panel. Thank you.
I was was hoping that Indra Lucero, an attorney in Colorado and Denver, would be here because she recently, thank goodness, I suspect on a completely pro bono basis, I think a father in Denver who had used medical marijuana was reported to child welfare. They did an investigation. They concluded that he was perfectly fine at parenting. But then getting his name off the child abuse registry was, took having a pro bono attorney to get him off that list. Those lists, like the box for if you've been convicted, will keep you from getting all kinds of employment. So there are many, many parallels. I have to say that representation in criminal cases is mostly hypothetical. And even though there are many more guarantees of protection and a right to counsel, it mostly doesn't exist, especially when plea bargaining is used in something over 90% of the cases. But there is even less protection in the child welfare system. And what's worse is in the criminal system, you're at least expected to fight for your rights. But as sociologist Jennifer Wright talks about in her book, Fixing Families, that if you stand up for your rights, you are less likely to get your children back. And if you
well, you usually get anger management or mental health evaluation if you even, object to what ACS is saying.
I just wanted to ask a question based on what you were saying. One of the things that you point out as great in terms of what's happening in states that have medical marijuana or legalized marijuana in terms of the parenting issue. Recently here in Colorado, the Denver Broncos has a linebacker named Von Miller who got suspended for six games for testing, we think, for marijuana. And so one of the things I did was wrote a letter to the editor to the Denver Post and say, wait a second, he's an adult, it's illegal to smoke marijuana in Colorado. How can the NFL, how can they suspend him? Although I knew the answer, but I wanted to raise this issue for the public so the public could see the contradiction. And I got a phone call from the NFL saying, hey, let's talk. So the point I'm asking, is maybe we should be doing these letters to the editors in states that have medical marijuana to raise this issue so the public knows what's going on. What do you think?
I think the NFL should be more concerned about gun possession and how they use their guns, but that's another aside.
I actually do agree that more people need to make this a bigger issue. People need to get it into the media, and especially people who don't have to be so afraid of what's going to happen to them if they do. If your kids are all grown up, if you're single, no kids, write a letter. Say that you think that if it's legal in Colorado, that it should be legal for everybody. Point out what's going on. Talk to your friends. Talk to your family. Talk to parents you know, people who might have kids someday. The more people who know what's going on here, the more people, the better it'll be.
I think you're absolutely right, and the only caution that I would have in that is that there is a serious risk for families who are currently experiencing CPS in their lives to going forward. And there is so much discretion that is given to these workers that any misstep or any perceived misstep can be used against you. And I'm not saying that it will never be beneficial to go forward with this, but yes, it's extremely risky. And because these cases often take place at the administrative level, they're often not reported, and so even lawyers don't know about them. And there aren't citations that we can write in our briefs that say what happened in a case because they're closed. They're closed in some states.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about exposing the families themselves. I was just thinking about the issue, just raising the issue for the general public to understand this contradiction. That's all.
Okay, do you want to say something?
I did, and I wanted to shift just a little bit because I know this is a lot about marijuana use in particular, but I would like to broaden it. And before I do that, I wanted to say that Von's problem was he switched out his cup with somebody else. So whatever he was positive for.
No, he was positive for marijuana. No, he had already tested positive for marijuana, so it was a likelihood. He knew he was positive. So
he switched his...
Right. But the point is, he wouldn't have had to switch if the NFL had a policy that was consistent with the state.
I hear you. Okay, all right. My comment really is that I understand the marijuana issues, and I certainly have seen the DEC folks get amped up around the legalization. What I would like to shift just a bit is to speak to all the other women who get involved with child welfare because of their substance use. And it's, again, poor women because they don't have the means to challenge the system once they get identified. And there's other components here to women who are using other substances that I'd like to just make sure we say out loud on the panel. And that is that in our recent study, it's been known that women who use tend to have histories of trauma. In our own study, even though it was a small sample, 98% of the women in the study had experienced some form of trauma over their lifetime, and the average number of traumatic experiences was 4.5 for these women. Now, I'm going to couple that with say, here's where the systems issues, the structural issues in our country come into play that child welfare does not address. And that is, women need to access mental health care or some type of help, even in their childhoods or growing up, to deal with the traumas as they experience them. That is not happening. And what I have found is that most women who are in substance use treatment really carry both. Yeah, they're using, but they also have mental health issues that can be treated and can be helped. And they do not routinely right now, even with decent women's treatment, they don't get mental health. And so there's still great risk in terms of going forward in the system. And these issues are not addressed in the assessment with child welfare. And two other things related. The National Child Welfare data tells us that depression is the #1 mental health issue with mothers of children who are in child welfare. However, there is no follow-up. We can't tell from the national data what kind of services mothers get who in fact need treatment for depression. There's another thought I'll tell you when it comes back around.
But they're not being removed because they have depression, though, right?
No, only that the depression is very often co-occurring with any substance use, is my point.
I should note a couple of things. One is that these systems are so out of control that in New Jersey, they have defined child abuse as causing harm to your child. And there's now an appellate court decision that says women who were addicted to opiates and using methadone treatment, the recommended treatment by our federal government, with methadone treatment is the only drug which during pregnancy the child may be born with a transitory and treatable set of symptoms that they recover from, that we know have known for 40 years how to treat. But there are courts in New Jersey have said that because women were in methadone treatment and therefore caused their children to be born with neonatal abstinence syndrome, they've caused harm and they are child abusers. So that even the attempt to get the recommendation that women get into treatment is punished. I'd like to make another observation on behalf of women who've come to this conference and harm reduction conferences who've been involved in the child welfare system, and they're very frustrated because they don't have the option of harm reduction. You're abstinent or not. You get your kids, but you will not get your kids back if you're doing harm reduction. So a whole area of learning and treatment and understanding is pretty much absent from the child welfare system. I have a few more questions that I just want to direct and then give everybody a chance to talk about some of the positive approaches. But Dr. Teel and Dr. Hart, there is for all the drugs. We have been very cannabis heavy because somebody uses cocaine, so because somebody uses methamphetamine or heroin doesn't mean they can't parent. And I've said that to child welfare people. I say, why are you relying on this? And they say, well, what else should we do? What can we do? And I said, don't you have, do you have any cases? Don't you have any cases of child abuse where the parent isn't using drugs? And they say yes. And they say, well, what questions do you ask then? The question is whether you can parent, not whether you've used a drug, because tons and tons of people in Greenwich Village on my fancy block use drugs. Nobody's questioning their ability to parent. So what I'd like you to, there's a federal agency, and there are claims that there is research that shows an association or a causal connection between drug use and an inability to parent. I'm wondering if you could comment on the quality of that research and the federal agency that promotes what they claim it found.
Yes, I'll do that. And let me tell you what I remembered I was going to tell you that's related, which is the National Center for Substance Abuse and Child Welfare, that's been in existence for 10 plus years, was thought to be kind of front line because it was the first time at the federal level you had SAMHSA, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services, and you had the Children's Bureau, which is child welfare. So the first time they come together with this national center, and from what I can tell, it is still very much a child welfare focus. There's some attempt to inform child welfare caseworkers about substance abuse. That's about the extent of it. And the current effort is moving more and more towards family drug courts as the answer to substance use and family issues. What I wanted to say is that through the National Center, they give regional partnership grants that are supposed to help the two systems come together, child welfare and treatment. Colorado had one of the first, didn't go very far after the fact. And I can tell you that today, in current time, there is still a lack of trust in child welfare systems and workers trusting the knowledge of women's treatment providers in assessing risk. And this is one reason that child welfare, when a woman needs residential treatment, and this is my advocacy issue, I believe that a woman should go home or should go with her newborn when they leave the hospital. And I believe as a society, we should have residential treatment beds available for those women and those children. It is standard practice, at least here in the metro area in Colorado, that babies are removed fairly routinely, and sometimes they've been identified by the prenatal health care provider and they've been flagged for testing when they're born. But in the metro area, and I'm having a former director who's sitting right here, we have one residential treatment facility that takes pregnant women or women with babies, and they have 16 beds for this entire Denver metro area. And the babies count as one and the mothers count as one. And when a woman needs that, child welfare does not want to use their core service dollars to pay for residential treatment because it costs more than outpatient. So they would rather pay for outpatient, let a woman bail out of that. But residential treatment is not a viable option.
Your question was about the connection between parenting and drug use, and there was the data that supports this notion. As you know, we are working on a review paper to try and get at this issue, to try and figure out the connection between, we're trying to figure out the connection between parents' drug use and their ability to parent. And just our sort of preliminary sort of overview or look at the literature now that we're hopefully will be finished writing up soon. There is no connection, there's no data to support that belief. But that doesn't mean that people won't continue to believe this. So when we think about drugs, we all have our views about the impact of methamphetamine, for example, on a person's ability to parent. And we know what those views are, in part because of shows like Breaking Bad. They kind of tell us what methamphetamine does. They're wrong, but it doesn't mean that this won't be solidified in the public's attention. So when we have this paper that come out, I think it's going to show that there's no connection, but that doesn't matter. One of the things I did in my seminar for the past at Columbia with graduate students and advanced undergraduate students, when we tried to find a connection between some negative neurological effects of parents who had tested positive for, or women who had tested positive for methamphetamine during their pregnancy. And we wanted to, because it's the whole new crack baby thing. And so we wanted to see whether or not there were neurological damage and so forth. And there have been a number of papers that had come out and claimed to have these deleterious or negative effects. But when you really look at the evidence, there's nothing. It's just a lot of hand waving. Now, that's not to say that people should go out and use illicit methamphetamine during pregnancy. That's not what that says. It's just, what I'm saying is that the evidence do not support the claims that people make. That's what I'm saying.
Yes. What I wanted to say was, included in the literature review, that Yale is looking at women using and attachment issues at birth, and they are doing brain studies and their contention is that if the substance is getting your reward system, then your reward system is less available to respond and attach in a positive way to newborns. I'm telling you, this is an NIDA-funded study, and they have also, just to include here, they're using the hormone that helps women breastfeed in a spray version to try to see if that increases women's ability when they're using or in early recovery.
No, you're absolutely right. Those kind of studies are being carried out from people who I actually respect. I know the folks who are doing those studies, but I assure you, when people start talking about the brain reward system and that sort of thing, it is oftentimes used as a way to lose you. It becomes voodoo. This notion of the brain reward system, and believe me, I've been trying to find it since 1992, and I've been studying the brain reward system. But when we're making these claims about what's happening with children in terms of the brain reward system, there is no evidence to support any of those wild speculations. I mean, that's just so wild. I would urge all of you all, please, to read my 2012 paper in neuropsychopharmacology. The title of it is something like, does methamphetamine cause cognitive impairments, a critical review. And I reviewed the neuroimaging literature and the cognition literature, and I systematically illustrate to the reader how they are being hoodwinked with the neuroimaging data. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't be doing neuroimaging, because we should. But the problem is that it has been done sloppily in our area. And this paper will help you to be a more critical consumer of that literature.
We were hoodwinked on the crack baby long-term effects, so we need to be, you're right, very vigilant about this other bullshit now we're being fed.
In fact, and I hope most of you got it.
Pardon my language.
The research.
That's all I'll tell you. There's drug exposed.
Well, they're drug exposed, but what the all of the science keeps finding. What?
Anybody ever talk to a crack baby about it?
Oh yeah, oh yeah. There, I know one. Yes, and she has a full scholarship to Fancy College. So that I just want to say that we didn't focus on the assumptions about prenatal exposure to drugs. All of the scientific research is it's not a good idea to use it.
Right.
To the extent we found harms, they are subtle. They are less than what we know the potential harms from cigarettes are, less than extreme alcohol use, and that this fear that children will be born with permanent neurological, irremediable damage simply has not been borne out by the science. And the next time there's a new permutation on an old drug, you will hear the same thing. It's instantly addictive. Pregnant women take it are damaging their children. These children will cost you money. None of it has been borne out by the research. And it's used to reinforce the idea that we can blame our societal problems on bad mothers who take drugs, not on the failure of our health system or our economic system or anything else. I want to ask Emma one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to questions and make sure the other panelists get to speak. And the two related questions are, when I first started doing this work, my assumption was the women who were targeted really were the women whose drug use was out of control, chaotic, and bad, and these were women who would benefit from residential treatment. And I think there are people who would like some kind of treatment that works. But I see more and more and more, including our newest case in Wisconsin, that people who do not need treatment are required to get treatment, and it is not treatment, it's something else, it's faux treatment. Because when people are coerced into treatment through child welfare systems at probation and parole, they must give up all of their confidentiality. And one of the main things about successful counseling is that you are guaranteed confidentiality, that what you say will not be used against you or shared with anybody else. And from the start, it is the assumption that if we fix this individual by surveilling them and getting their confidential information, we're going to solve all of our social problems. What the people in these systems are required to get is not treatment. And therefore, the two questions are, what do you see around the treatment that's required of your clients, and what do you think of drug courts, family drug courts?
Okay. Well, first of all, one thing I do want to just add is that the other piece of the story about what we did to those children who we predicted were doomed to failure because of what they were exposed to prenatally is that we put them in foster care, and they've since been discharged to homelessness without education, without access to health services. So, you know, the system itself has actually caused that generation of children a lot of harm. And we still see that, despite the fact that the myths have been recalled and new research has come out, we still see children that once they're labeled as drug exposed, they become pretty much unadoptable. And they're viewed as unable to be loved and will never love anyone else. And so they are the children most likely to languish in care and never find a permanent family situation. But to answer the question about treatment, I mean, it's not treatment. And I do have clients who want treatment. What we've tried to do in the Bronx is get treatment out of the court system and out of ACS. So we just developed, we just had a very small grant, but I can't believe they gave it to us. I think it's because we called it Healthy Mothers, Healthy Babies, and that made people think they should fund it.
Semantics.
But basically what it is we do know your rights trainings for pregnant women who already have children in the foster care system on how to keep their babies, how to get access to prenatal care, and if they need treatment, how to get that treatment and not lose their baby when the baby's born. And so we attend births, so we are there when ACS comes knocking. They are represented while they're pregnant. And it's an interesting thing, because as Lynn said, I was the director of legal advocacy at NAPW, and so the last thing we want is the state to be regulating women while they're pregnant. On the other hand, we don't want the state to get involved at the birth and the woman not ever having had an opportunity to get treatment or services beforehand. So this is sort of a, you know, it's cloaked by attorney-client privilege. So whatever they tell us they're doing, we're not allowed to tell anyone. And so it's strictly voluntary. And what we found, we're very new, it's a very new project, but we've had 7 babies born to women whose older children are in foster care, and all have gone home with their moms from the birth. But family treatment treatment court, basically in the Bronx, we got rid of it. After we got a small grant to represent parents in the Bronx, we then luckily worked really hard and we became the institutional provider. So now we represent 90% of women and men who are accused of abusing or neglecting their kids. And so our courthouse had a family court, which everyone said, oh, family court is so great. You get to go in and you just make an admission to child abuse. But then the judge is like really nice and understands treatment, and so your client will have a much better experience. So we went in there and we did, this is just like criminal court, right? You go in, you take a plea in criminal court, and then your sentence is not jail, it's treatment. But if you fuck up, where are you going? Well, in family court, it's almost more evil. Because what we were finding is, first of all, the judges knew nothing more about treatment or substance use or substance dependence. They never even heard of the term harm reduction. And what they would do is if you were tested every day you came to court, and if you relapsed, you lost visitation with your kid. So you didn't go to jail, but your visitation was reduced to once a week. You had been enjoying twice a week, now you got once a week.
And how do they justify that's in the best interest of the child?
They don't even really try to. I mean, honestly, they just, or I have judges look at me and say, Miss Ketteringham, just tell your client it's drugs or her kids. Just tell her. And I'd say, oh, great idea, okay, awesome.
Brilliant, I never thought of that.
Because there's this presumption that it's failure of will, that it's not. So even my clients who really needed treatment, who were dependent, who asked me to find them treatment, were then put in a treatment court where, yes, everyone clapped if you had days in a row that were where you tested negative for drugs. But you were punished, and your children were punished whenever you tested positive. So we just stopped going there. Plus, the difference between family court and criminal court is at the end of it, if you did succeed and you did do the treatment that they asked you to do, it's not like you got your kids back. And it's not like you weren't still listed as a child abuser in the state registry, because you were. And there your name would remain until your youngest child turns 28. We're not sure why it's 28, but that's what the New York State Legislature said. So you don't get anything out of going to family court. There isn't even a legal incentive to go to family court. So we stopped going, and now it's gone, because there were no families in it. And literally the little crew of people in Bronx Family Court who run around and drug test everybody don't really have anything to do. So now, they're pulled into every courtroom. This is one of the problems, is that they're pulled into every courtroom and they drug test everybody all the time, because they don't really have a role anymore, because they don't have their treatment court. But anyway, yeah, so I don't think very highly of family court, and neither did any of my clients. And had their children been allowed into the courtroom, I don't think they would have liked it either.
We're going to save time at the end for each panelist to talk about another positive thing that they're undertaking that can address the issues of the ways in which the child welfare system advances and builds on the drug war. But I want to get a few questions here.